HOA. Karen fined a retired electrician $30,000 for a cabin outside their jurisdiction. Now their board faces court. $30,000, Jacob. That's the fine, and it compounds daily, Brenda sneered, slapping the thick, cream-colored envelope onto his porch railing with a sharp smack. You think because you wired houses for 40 years, you can just build a hideous shack in our pristine neighborhood? That cabin violates 7 different architectural guidelines, and if you don't tear it down by Friday, the board will place a lien on your home. Jacob looked at the trembling vein in her forehead, then down at the crisp paper. He'd spent 2 years clearing that adjacent woodland for his retirement sanctuary. "Brenda," he said, quietly, his calloused hands folding the notice. "You might want to check a map before you threaten a man's home." The hum of electricity had been the soundtrack of Jacob's entire adult life. For 42 years, he had crawled through sweltering attics, navigated damp basements, and traced miles of copper wire through the skeletal frames of half-built houses. He was a master electrician, a man who understood how power flowed, how to ground dangerous currents, and how to bring light to dark places. But when his wife, Sarah, passed away from a sudden illness 3 years ago, the light in Jacob's own life had abruptly short-circuited. The sprawling, 4-bedroom house they had shared in the manicured subdivision of Oak Ridge Estates suddenly felt like a cavernous, echoing museum of memories he wasn't ready to face. To keep his hands busy and his mind from descending into an abyss of grief, Jacob needed a project. He found his salvation in a neglected, half-acre sliver of dense woodland bordering his backyard. It was an odd, triangular parcel of old-growth oak and twisted cedar that the original developers had deemed too steep and irregular to build a suburban tract home upon. When the county put the orphaned lot up for public auction, Jacob had quietly purchased it for a fraction of its potential value. It was wild, untamed, and perfect. His vision was simple: a modest, beautifully crafted woodworking cabin. It would be a place where he could smell fresh pine, listen to the rain drum against a tin roof, and restore antique furniture, a hobby Sarah had always begged him to take up in his retirement. He pulled the necessary county permits, surveyed the land, and set to work. Pouring the foundation himself, framing the walls with meticulous precision, and wiring the cabin with an off-grid solar setup, Jacob found a slow, quiet healing in the labor. Every nail driven felt like a small step forward, but Oak Ridge Estates was not a place that appreciated the wild or the untamed. It was a realm governed by strict uniformity, perfectly edged lawns, and an homeowners association board ruled with an iron, manicured fist by a woman named Brenda. Brenda was a retired corporate middle manager who had repurposed her aggressive micromanagement skills into local suburban tyranny. She drove a customized, lifted golf cart equipped with an amber flashing light, patrolling the neighborhood with a clipboard and a laser measuring tape. She cited people for leaving their trash cans out 3 minutes past the designated hour, for painting their front doors a shade of beige that wasn't strictly Navajo white, and for allowing their grass to grow a 1/4 inch above the mandated limit. Jacob had always kept his head down, maintaining his primary property to her exacting standards to avoid the headache. But the cabin was different. It sat tucked away in the trees, barely visible from the street, yet it became the focal point of Brenda's obsessive ire. The harassment began with a polite but firm notice taped to his mailbox. It claimed unauthorized outbuilding construction and demanded immediate submission of architectural blueprints to the HOA review committee. Jacob, knowing the land was separate from his HOA-bound lot, simply threw the notice in the recycling bin. A week later, Brenda arrived in person. Jacob was on the roof of the cabin, securing the flashing around a small wood stove chimney, when he heard the whine of the electric golf cart. "Jacob!" Brenda's voice sliced through the tranquil morning air like a circular saw. She was marching through the underbrush, her sensible walking shoes snapping twigs, a look of profound offense on her face. "I have sent you 3 notices. You cannot build a shanty in Oak Ridge Estates. This is a premier community, not a rural trailer park." Jacob carefully set his hammer down, wiped his brow with the back of a calloused hand, and looked down from the roof. "Morning, Brenda. It's a woodworking shop, not a shanty, and it's permitted through the county." "The county does not supersede the Oak Ridge architectural covenants," she snapped, waving a thick binder of bylaws at him. "You need approval for any structure over 100 square feet. That monstrosity is easily 400. Furthermore, natural wood siding is strictly prohibited. It must be stucco or vinyl lap, painted an approved earth tone." "Brenda, I'm going to save us both a lot of time," Jacob said, his voice calm and steady, the voice of a man who had spent decades dealing with panicked general contractors. "This cabin isn't part of Oak Ridge. It's on a separate parcel. Your rules don't apply here." Brenda's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. It was the look of a predator whose authority had just been questioned by prey. "Everything within the perimeter fences of Oak Ridge is under the jurisdiction of this board. Do not test me, Jacob. I have the power to make your retirement very, very uncomfortable." She spun on her heel and marched back to her cart. Over the next month, the harassment escalated into a psychological siege. Brenda mobilized the HOA board, sending weekly registered letters. She posted passive-aggressive updates on the neighborhood Facebook group, thinly veiled posts about rogue elements destroying property values. She even called the county code enforcement, hoping to catch Jacob without permits, only to be turned away when the inspectors found his work not just compliant, but practically commercial grade. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Jacob had just finished installing a beautiful, hand-carved mahogany door on the cabin when Brenda marched up his driveway, accompanied by 2 silent, intimidating men from the HOA board. That was when she delivered the envelope. $30,000, a calculated sum meant to cripple him, to force a foreclosure or a surrender. It represented almost entirely his liquid savings, the buffer he had built for medical emergencies in his old age. As he stood on his porch, watching Brenda's golf cart speed away into the drizzle, the quiet peace he had fought so hard to build in the woods shattered. He was terrified. But beneath the terror, a spark of the old master electrician ignited. Brenda had just flipped the wrong switch, and Jacob was about to show her the true meaning of resistance. The sheer magnitude of the fine felt like a physical weight on Jacob's chest. $30,000 wasn't a penalty. It was a hostile takeover. For the first 2 nights, he barely slept, sitting in the dark of his kitchen, nursing cold coffee and staring at the sprawling neighborhood map on the county app. The threat of a lien on his home, the home where he and Sarah had raised their children, was a terrifying prospect. But as the panic began to subside, a cold, methodical logic took its place. Jacob was a man who solved complex problems by tracing the lines back to the source. If the power was out, you didn't yell at the light bulb. You checked the breaker. He needed to check Brenda's breaker. Early Thursday morning, Jacob drove downtown to the county records office. It was a cavernous, poorly lit building that smelled of damp paper, floor wax, and bureaucratic stagnation. He found the zoning department and asked to pull the original plat maps for the Oak Ridge Estates subdivision, dating back to its incorporation 25 years ago. An elderly clerk with thick glasses led him to a large, slanted drafting table and rolled out a massive, brittle blueprint. For 3 hours, Jacob pored over the lines, using a magnifying glass and a plastic ruler. He traced the boundary of Oak Ridge Estates, matching the surveyor's coordinates against the modern satellite imagery on his tablet. Then he saw it. The original developer had drawn the eastern boundary of the HOA along the natural curve of Willow Creek. Jacob's original home lot backed up right against that creek, but the woodland parcel he had bought later, the triangle where his cabin now stood, was firmly 50 feet across the creek. It was a completely separate subdivision tract that had never been legally annexed into Oak Ridge Estates. Brenda's jurisdiction ended at the water's edge, but as Jacob continued to trace the boundary line northward along the creek, his heart began to pound against his ribs. The revelation wasn't just about his cabin. The heavy black line of the HOA boundary remained firmly on the west side of the creek. However, over the years, the Oak Ridge HOA had built a community nature trail, a playground, and a lavish, stone-paved community barbecue area. Looking closely at the map, Jacob realized that all of those amenities were built on the east side of the creek. They were on county land, and it got worse. Tracing the line to the northernmost cul-de-sac, Jacob found Brenda's property. 10 years ago, she had expanded her backyard, building a massive, ornate wooden gazebo and a sprawling concrete patio. The county map clearly showed that the back 40 feet of Brenda's manicured oasis, including the gazebo, were situated on public conservation land. The HOA wasn't just policing outside its jurisdiction. They were actively squatting on public property, using neighborhood dues to maintain illegal structures, while Brenda herself was guilty of a massive, unpermitted land grab. Armed with this explosive truth, Jacob didn't go home. He drove straight to the offices of Elias, a sharp, hungry property lawyer whose father Jacob had done electrical work for years ago. Elias listened to Jacob's story, reviewed the copied plat maps, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Jacob," Elias said, leaning back in his leather chair. "They haven't just overstepped. They've committed fraud. They are collecting HOA dues to maintain structures on land they don't own, and they are using intimidation tactics to enforce covenants on private non-HOA property. We aren't just going to get this fine dismissed. We are going to dismantle them." But Brenda wasn't waiting for legal proceedings. Drunk on her own perceived authority and infuriated by Jacob's lack of compliance, she decided to make an example of him. The following Monday morning, Jacob was inside the cabin, sanding a piece of reclaimed oak, when the floorboards began to vibrate. A deep, guttural diesel rumble echoed through the trees. He stepped outside to see a massive, yellow bulldozer idling at the edge of his property line, just across the creek. Standing next to it, holding a walkie-talkie and wearing a smug grin, was Brenda. Next to her was a local contractor known for doing shady, off-the-books demolition work. "Last chance, Jacob," Brenda yelled over the engine roar. "The board has authorized the immediate remediation of this unauthorized structure. Step aside, or you'll be billed for the demolition costs as well." Jacob's blood ran cold, but he didn't flinch. He walked slowly down the incline, stopping right at the edge of his property line, planting his boots firmly in the dirt. "You bring that machine 1 inch across this creek, Brenda, and it's grand theft and trespassing," Jacob shouted back, pulling his phone from his pocket and hitting record. "I will have the operator arrested, and I will sue you into bankruptcy." "It's community enforcement," Brenda screeched, her face flushing a deep, angry purple. She waved her arm at the operator. "Go, tear it down!" The bulldozer lurched forward, its massive steel blade lowering. Jacob didn't move a muscle. He stood like a statue, staring directly into the eyes of the operator. The machine rumbled closer, the diesel exhaust choking the air. 10 feet. 5 feet. The operator, seeing the unwavering old man and the glowing red light of the phone camera, suddenly slammed on the brakes. The machine shuddered to a halt, the blade hovering mere inches from Jacob's property line. "I'm not running over an old man for an HOA dispute, lady," The operator yelled down to Brenda, killing the engine. "You told me this was an abandoned shed on your property." Brenda was apoplectic, screaming at the contractor. But the moment was lost. Jacob smiled grimly, ended the recording, and sent the video directly to Elias. The trap was set. Now, it was time to spring it in front of an audience. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center was a sterile, overly air-conditioned building that smelled faintly of chlorine from the adjacent pool and cheap, stale coffee. Every third Thursday of the month, the HOA board held its mandatory meeting here, an event usually attended by a sparse, miserable handful of residents seeking approval to plant a bush or desperately begging for leniency on minor infractions. Tonight, however, the room was packed to standing room only. Brenda had spent the week hyping up the meeting on the community forum, promising a decisive resolution regarding the rogue construction threatening our property values. She wanted a public execution. She wanted to humiliate Jacob so thoroughly that no one would ever question her authority again. Brenda sat at the center of the folding tables, arranged at the front of the room, flanked by 4 nervous-looking board members who usually just rubber-stamped her dictates. She wore a sharp, aggressive crimson blazer, her clipboard resting in front of her like a shield. For the first 40 minutes, Brenda ruled her kingdom. She rejected a young couple's request to install solar panels, claiming they were unsightly. She fined a single mother for having a tricycle visible from the street. She reveled in the power, her voice ringing out through the cheap PA system, cutting down any dissent with citing obscure bylaws and threatening fines. Finally, she checked her watch, her eyes scanning the crowd with a predatory gleam. Now, we move to the matter of the unapproved, hazardous shack constructed by Jacob on Lot 42. As you all know, the board issued a $30,000 fine, which has gone unpaid. Therefore, we are voting tonight to initiate foreclosure proceedings on his primary residence to recoup the debt and fund the demolition. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. Foreclosure was the nuclear option, rarely used and deeply feared. Before the vote could be called, the heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open. Jacob walked in, wearing his best Sunday suit, his posture straight and unyielding. Beside him walked Elias, carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase. The room went dead silent. "You are out of order, Jacob," Brenda barked into the microphone, standing up and pointing a perfectly manicured finger at him. "This is a voting period. Security, please escort these men out." There was no security, only a confused teenage lifeguard who peeked out from the pool office and quickly retreated. Jacob ignored her, walking straight down the center aisle until he reached the front table. "I have the floor, Brenda," Jacob said, his voice carrying effortlessly without a microphone. It was the commanding boom of a foreman on a noisy job site. "And you aren't voting on anything tonight." "How dare you!" Brenda sputtered. "I am the president of this association. I will add another $5,000 to your fine for disruption." Elias stepped forward, opening his briefcase and pulling out 5 thick, professionally bound folders. He handed one to each of the board members, placing the last one directly on top of Brenda's clipboard. "My name is Elias, and I represent Jacob," the lawyer said smoothly, his voice a stark contrast to Brenda's screech. "What you are holding is a formal notice of a civil lawsuit, a restraining order, and an injunction. Furthermore, it contains certified copies of the county plat maps and a surveyor's report completed this afternoon." Brenda scoffed, refusing to open the folder. "We don't care about your fake documents. Our bylaws are ironclad." "Your bylaws," Elias countered, turning to face the crowd of residents, "only apply to land you actually govern. If you open to page 3, you will see the legally recorded boundary of Oak Ridge Estates. It ends at Willow Creek. Jacob's cabin is 50 feet past the creek. It is not in the HOA. You have fined a man $30,000 for building a legal structure on land you do not, and have never, controlled. A collective gasp echoed in the room. The other board members frantically flipped open their folders, their eyes widening in horror as they traced the boundary lines. "That's a lie!" Brenda yelled, her composure cracking. "The developer gave us that land. It's community property." "The developer abandoned that land, and the county reclaimed it 20 years ago," Jacob said quietly. He turned to the crowd, his eyes meeting the faces of his neighbors, people he had helped, people who had been bullied for years. "But that's not the worst part, folks. Look at page 5. Elias took over, his voice projecting clearly. Page 5 outlines the community nature trail, the barbecue pits, and the playground, all built and maintained with your HOA dues. All of them are on public county land. This board has been misappropriating tens of thousands of dollars of your money to build on land they don't own, opening this entire neighborhood to massive legal liability from the county." The room erupted. Neighbors who had been cowed into silence for years suddenly found their voices. Shouts of anger and betrayal rained down on the front table. "And finally," Elias said, raising his voice to cut through the din, "page 7. A detailed survey of Brenda's personal residence. That beautiful, massive gazebo she hosts her wine nights in. It extends 40 feet onto a protected county nature reserve. She built it without permits, using an HOA-approved contractor paid for out of the general maintenance fund. Pandemonium broke loose. One of the board members, a pale, sweating accountant, threw his folder down and stood up. "I resign. I didn't know about this. She told us everything was legal." He sprinted out of the back doors. Brenda stood frozen, her face drained of all color, her hands shaking violently. The illusion of her absolute power had been shattered with a few pieces of paper. She looked at Jacob, expecting to see gloating, expecting to see a mirror of her own cruelty, but Jacob just looked at her with profound pity. "You tried to take my home, Brenda," he said softly, audible only to her amidst the shouting crowd. "But the only one losing everything tonight is you." He turned and walked back down the aisle, the crowd parting for him with newfound respect, leaving Brenda standing alone to face the wrath of the community she had terrorized for a decade. The courtroom was paneled in dark, solemn oak, a stark contrast to the cheap folding tables of the community center. 6 months had passed since the explosive HOA meeting, and the legal gears, though slow, had ground with devastating precision. Jacob sat quietly at the plaintiff's table beside Elias, his hands neatly folded. Across the aisle sat Brenda, looking visibly diminished. The aggressive crimson blazers were gone, replaced by a drab, muted grey suit. She sat completely alone. The rest of the board had immediately resigned and cut plea deals with the community to avoid personal liability, throwing Brenda entirely under the proverbial bus. Judge Harrison, a no-nonsense magistrate with a reputation for loathing frivolous litigation, peered over his reading glasses at the mountain of evidence Elias had submitted. Brenda's attorney, a desperate, overpriced corporate lawyer she had retained using the last of her personal savings, tried to argue that the boundary lines were ambiguous and that the HOA had operated in good faith. Judge Harrison didn't even let him finish his opening statement. "Counselor," the judge rumbled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "There is nothing ambiguous about a geographic creek bed clearly marked on a county plat map from 1998. Your client didn't operate in good faith. She operated a fiefdom. She issued a punitive, ruinous fine of $30,000 without a shred of legal jurisdiction, and then attempted to dispatch a bulldozer to destroy private property." The judge slammed a file shut with a crack like a pistol shot. "The $30,000 fine is hereby nullified and vacated with prejudice." The injunction barring Ms. Brenda or any representative of the Oak Ridge HOA from approaching or interfering with Jacob's property is made permanent. Jacob let out a long, slow breath, feeling a knot he hadn't realized was sitting in his chest finally dissolve. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, turning his severe gaze directly onto Brenda, who visibly shrank in her chair. Regarding the countersuit for harassment, emotional distress, and the misappropriation of community funds, the evidence shows a staggering pattern of abuse of power. Ms. Brenda, you utilized community dues to enrich your own property by building an illegal structure on protected public land, while simultaneously terrorizing your neighbors over the color of their front doors. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, a reflexive defense mechanism, but her lawyer put a firm hand on her arm, silencing her. I am ordering you to pay restitution to the plaintiff in the amount of $50,000 for legal fees and emotional distress, the judge declared. Additionally, I am forwarding the surveyor's reports to county code enforcement. You have 30 days to demolish your illegal gazebo and remediate the public land at your own personal expense. If you fail to do so, the county will do it for you and place a lien on your property. The poetic justice of the sentence hung in the quiet courtroom. Brenda had tried to put a lien on Jacob's home for a legal cabin. Now, she faced a lien for her own illegal vanity project. The gavel fell, a sharp, decisive crack that signaled the end of an era. The aftermath reshaped the community entirely. Brenda, facing bankruptcy from the legal fees and the restitution, was forced to quietly sell her home and move away. The day the demolition crew arrived to tear down her lavish gazebo, half the neighborhood stood on the sidewalks, watching in silent, vindicated satisfaction. The Oak Ridge HOA was reformed from the ground up. The new board, elected by a highly motivated and newly educated community, rewrote the bylaws. They slashed the ridiculous architectural constraints, lowered the dues, and focused strictly on maintaining the actual neighborhood entrance and the streetlights. They also worked with the county to legally lease the land where the playground sat, doing things the right way. As for Jacob, his life returned to the quiet rhythm he had sought from the beginning. Spring arrived, painting the woodland in vibrant strokes of green. The cabin was finally finished. It was a masterpiece of rustic architecture, warm and inviting. One late afternoon, Jacob stood on the porch of his cabin, a mug of coffee in his hand. He listened to the gentle bubbling of Willow Creek, the physical line that had saved him. The smell of fresh sawdust and old pine drifted through the open door, mixing with the crisp evening air. He ran his hand along the smooth, sanded railing he had built himself. He thought of Sarah, and for the first time in years, the memory brought a soft smile rather than a sharp pang of grief. He had defended his sanctuary. He had stood his ground against a bully who thought power was absolute, proving that true power lies in knowing your rights and having the courage to enforce them. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long, golden shadows across the forest floor, Jacob stepped back inside his cabin, turned on the lights he had wired with his own 2 hands, and finally, truly, found his peace. Sometimes, the greatest defense against petty tyranny isn't anger, but quiet, undeniable truth. Jacob's battle reminds us that bullies rely on the illusion of power, thriving only until someone has the courage to draw a line in the sand, or in this case, a property line. When faced with unjust authority, always verify, always stand your ground, and never let anyone intimidate you out of your rightful peace. If Jacob's triumph over the HOA board inspired you, please hit that like button, share this story with a friend who loves sweet justice, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life stories of people fighting back and winning. Until next time, stay strong and know your rights.